Someone asks a man in his mid-50s why he's not on Facebook. Not Instagram either. No Twitter, no TikTok, nothing. And he doesn't fumble with an explanation about not understanding how it works. He just looks at them calmly and says something like, "I tried it. It wasn't for me." And then the conversation moves on. The person who asked is left with a strange feeling, like they expected a longer answer and didn't get one, like something went unsaid. What these people understand, and what most others haven't stopped long enough to figure out, is what we're going to talk about today. Because the psychology behind people who walk away from social media after 50 is more deliberate and more revealing than most people give it credit for. Let's start by clearing up the most common assumption about this group. The assumption is that people over 50 who don't use social media simply never figured it out, that they're a step behind, still living in a pre-smartphone world because the technology moved faster than they did. It's a condescending read, and in most cases, it's completely wrong. A significant number of people in this group were on social media. They had the accounts. They used the platforms. They spent time scrolling, posting, checking notifications like everyone else. And then, at some point, they stopped. Not because they couldn't keep up, but because they'd seen enough to make a decision. Psychologists call this process disillusionment, the gradual erosion of an initial positive impression as a clearer picture of something's true nature emerges. It's not bitterness. It's not cynicism. It's simply what happens when someone pays close enough attention long enough to see past the surface of a thing. What they saw, once they looked clearly, was that social media is not primarily a connection platform. It is an attention extraction machine. Every design choice, the infinite scroll, the notification system, the variable reward of likes and comments, is engineered to keep users on the platform as long as possible. Researchers who study what's called persuasive technology have noted that these systems are built on the same psychological mechanisms as slot machines. Unpredictable rewards delivered at unpredictable intervals, which is precisely the pattern most effective at creating compulsive behavior. People who have lived long enough carry a particular advantage here. They've seen enough manipulative systems in their lives, in advertising, in politics, in relationships, to recognize the pattern when it shows up in a new form. The recognition doesn't always come immediately, but it comes, and once it does, it's very difficult to unsee. Now let's talk about what these people noticed happening inside themselves, because this is where the psychology gets precise. Attention is not an unlimited resource. Every cognitive scientist working in this area agrees on that much. The brain has a finite capacity for sustained focus, and every time it's pulled into a low-stakes, high-stimulation environment, a social media feed, for example, it draws down that capacity. The scrolling feels passive. It isn't. It's cognitively expensive in ways that don't announce themselves until later. When you try to sit with something that requires real concentration and find it harder than it used to be. There's also a more subtle psychological cost that researchers have been documenting for years. Social comparison theory, first described by Leon Festinger in the 1950s, holds that human beings have a persistent drive to evaluate themselves relative to others. Social media doesn't create this tendency, but it feeds it constantly and without mercy. Every post, every highlight reel, every curated image of someone else's life becomes a data point in an ongoing comparison process that the brain runs largely outside conscious awareness. The result, for most people, is a low-level but persistent sense of not quite measuring up. Not dramatic enough to clearly identify as a problem. Just a quiet, chronic background dissatisfaction that follows you away from the screen. People who eventually leave social media for good often describe a similar turning point. They started noticing a pattern in themselves. After time on these platforms, they consistently felt worse. Not devastated, just subtly diminished. Less focused, less settled, less satisfied with the texture of their actual lives. Once you've confirmed that pattern enough times, the cost-benefit calculation changes entirely. This is what psychologists call metacognitive awareness, the capacity to observe the effects of an experience on your own thinking and emotional state, rather than simply living inside the experience. It's a skill that tends to develop with age and self-reflection. And in this context, It's what allows certain people to see social media clearly rather than just feeling vaguely uncomfortable with it. But here's what might be the most psychologically significant piece of all this, and it's the one that gets talked about the least. The people who leave social media after 50 and never come back aren't just leaving because of what the platforms were doing to them. They're leaving because their lives outside the platforms were already full in ways that made the trade-off obvious. Think about what social media actually provides for younger users. A space to build and project an identity. A source of social validation during years when external approval feels essential. A way to stay connected when real-world relationships are thin or difficult to maintain. A way to fill quiet moments that would otherwise feel empty. These are real psychological needs. And for people who are still working out who they are and where they belong, social media can feel genuinely useful. People in their 50s and beyond have, in most cases, already resolved those questions. They know who they are. They have relationships with actual history behind them, people they've been through things with, whose presence in their lives doesn't require a feed to maintain. They've built routines and rituals that give their days meaning and texture. The quiet moments don't feel empty. They feel like their own. When you already have those things, the social media value proposition collapses. You're not looking for validation because you're not building an identity from scratch anymore. You're not filling a void because there isn't one. And the connections that matter to you aren't maintained through posts. They're maintained through phone calls, meals, and the accumulated weight of shared time. One consistent finding in research on aging and well-being is that as people get older, they become more selective about where they invest their social energy, and more satisfied with fewer, deeper connections rather than many shallow ones. Social media runs entirely counter to that tendency. It's built for breadth. These people have chosen depth. And once that becomes clear, leaving isn't really a sacrifice. It's just an honest accounting of what actually matters. So let's be clear about who these people actually are. They are not technophobes. They are not isolated. They are not people who got left behind by a changing world. They are people who looked at something most of the population accepted without much scrutiny, understood what it was doing and what it was costing, and made a deliberate decision that it didn't belong in their lives. In a world where social media presence is treated as a default, where not having an account is seen as the thing that requires explanation, these people are doing something quietly countercultural. They're exercising a kind of autonomy over their own attention and inner life that most people have surrendered without quite realizing it. The question isn't why they left. The question is why the rest of us haven't stopped long enough to ask ourselves the same thing. If this gave you something to think about, share it with someone you think might need to hear it. And if there's a type of person or a way of living you've always been curious about, leave it in the comments. That's usually where the next video starts. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next video.